Hello and welcome to the Beyond podcast. I'm your host, Robert Crighton, General Overseer of Beyond, which specialises in creating full-cast audio adaptations of drama from before 1642, as well as providing background and other production resources. You can support our work and get a say into what we produce by becoming a patron today. Go to www.patreon.com/Beyond Shakespeare. Anyway, today, I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Stephen Longstaffe, editor of the only critical edition of The Life and Death of Jack Straw out there. I say out there, it's incredibly difficult to get a hold of, it is out of print and incredibly expensive, but it's worth it because it's really, really good. I continue with my ongoing apology for many of our discussing episodes. It's an ongoing mega apology. This is another, I think, as this gets released, the final discussing episode that was lost. Recordings made in some cases years ago and never released it for a number of reasons. Not just the pandemic, but also other technical reasons. Delayed them all. This was recorded, I think, in late 2019. I've actually lost the email chain to tell me when it was. It was also recorded via the telephone, so it's a bit ropey, but what we lack in audio fidelity we make up in length, and this isn't even the complete cut. The uncut version is available on the Patreon feed. It's about 2 hours long. It might be less than that. I might have actually cut it down before it went to the patrons, but it's long. It's really long. It was a really good chat. I can only apologise again for the late appearance of this episode. It was going to go out with our full cast audio adaptation, which is online now, and then was delayed to go out with our live stage version, which was cancelled by COVID, and then COVID put everything back, and now, at last, it sees the light of day. So, my guest from the past, who are you? And what is your purpose in life?
I'm Dr. Steve Longstaffe, and I've been thinking about non-Shakespearean English history plays since I did my PhD, which is now, started that over 30 years ago. I'm particularly interested in non-Shakespearean histories because I'm interested in the ways in which different angles were possible on the history of, well, particularly the history of England in the medieval period leading into the early modern period. And more recently, I've also got interested in staging and clowning and how scripts got to stages and what kind of performance conditions and conventions there were and how we can maybe expand our sense of those, for example, to include more consideration of how improvisation may have worked and to come up with a less restrictive version, really, which comes out of my commitment to an ideal of theatre, if you like, or of performance. And I think one of the things about literary approaches is that the multiple kind of pleasures and possibilities of performance are kind of blanked, really.
We're talking about Jack Straw, the life and death of. So how did you come across this, and how did this play come into your sphere?
Well, I came across it because way back when I was writing my thesis, I was interested in the representation of commons risings in the Elizabethan history play. And there are quite a few, but Jack Straw is the only play which just deals with a commons rising. Other plays offer it as part of a broader spectrum take on dynastic politics. What drew me to Jack Straw, I suppose, was the sense that, and I think this is still true to some extent, that it's a founding moment in what you might call an English radical tradition. It's the starting point for a lineage which, continues through to the present day, which is involved with collective political struggle, collective consciousness, and collective histories. So, if you come into the closer to the present day, 1381, the Peasants' Revolt. In 1981, when there were poll tax riots, people were talking about the Peasants' Revolt. William Morris famously creates the Dream of John Ball in the 1880s, and it's part of the kind of, might call it an invented tradition maybe, of English political discourse. And so as it's a founding moment, really, I was really, really curious to see what was sayable and actable on an early modern stage when in the 80s, when I was starting reading about it, everybody was utterly convinced that there's only one reason to put any kind of commons action on the stage, and that's to kind of either horrify the audience or to make them laugh at the rebels. And particularly as well because the focus of, I think, all of the representations of commons actions is what they do in London, and the 1590s in London is a hungry time. It's a war time, and there are great fears about civil disorder. And I suppose my starting point is, well, it depends where you stand, how you feel about civil disorder and how you feel about what happens to London when the commons get going.
And it is a very London-centric play. It doesn't really deal... I mean, obviously, the rebels come from outside of London, but the action of the play is very much London-based.
Yeah, I mean, I think really... I mean, if you go into John Stow's Survey of London, which is published in the 1590s, it seems clear to me that there are so many landmarks in London. There are landmarks all around us wherever we are, but London landmarks are charged with moments in national history. So depending on where you can think of yourself as being, and that might be one of the things we might want to discuss, is where we possibly think Jack Straw may have been played. You know, we've got London Bridge, we've got Smithfield, we've got a range of place names, and Stowe is quite clear that if you go down Eastcheap, you know, you will come across points, say London Stone, for example, which is not strictly Eastcheap, where the history of the nation and the history of London coincide.
So, shall we talk more specifically about the play itself? When did it come about? Who do we think may have it come about for? Who might have been performing it? And where might it have... or sort of that whole universe of how does this play come into being, of which I suspect the answer is we don't really know.
Well, I mean, we don't have anything to do with the play itself, which gives us a sense of the author. There have been a couple of plays recently made for George Peele as an author. There was a piece published not that long ago taking a kind of stylometric approach using a commercial computer analysis. But I'm not so sure, simply because the state of the text we've got and the trajectory, which I think is most believable, seems not to fit with the idea that it is a fully fledged record in some sense of a play which was finished and performed for 3 hours or 2.5 hours in a purpose-built theatre.
Yeah, because the text as we have it is very short, even for shorter plays of the period. My reckoning is saying like 8,500 words. When you're thinking a 2-hour plus play is something in the region of 20,000, it's not a long text.
No, I mean, when I did the edition, and which is it was over 20 years ago now that I was working on it, really, I could only find one published play which was shorter, and that was the Yorkshire Tragedy, which is a very different kind of play, a very different kind of text, in fact. The Old Wives' Tale, which is a Peele play, I think is pretty short as well.
Yeah, they're comparable, but I think Old Wives' Tale, I think, has it by a nose.
But, I mean, there's some really interesting work coming out now, which I'm quite persuaded by, which is to reorient people's attention to some of the London inns, to think about the kind of performances that are there. And there's been a couple of really interesting articles two or three, in fact, Lawrence Manley, Paul Menser, forgotten the other person, and a young scholar, who have all imagined in different ways what an in performance would be. And one of the things that they seem to be clear on is that the inns like the Cross Keys, the Bell, which are just sort of up Gracechurch Street, heading, on the sort of road out of London to the north, which is where some of the later public playhouses are built. They're places to play during the winter. And, we've got various bits of documentation, people promising not to start until 3 o'clock. Well, winter in London, it gets dark at 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
So we are talking about the conventional answer, a decade or two ago would be that they kind of cut down for touring. But there may be a further possibility, which is that touring and performance in an inn, when you really don't have an awful lot of time, and it's a multi-purpose space as well, might lead us to something like Jack Straw. And that's more or less where I am now. I think I find it interesting, because some of the most likely candidates for in performance are very close to Jack Straw's Wat Tyler's route into the city, because there's only one way in from Kent, which is over London Bridge.
Yes.
And Gracechurch Street effectively leads to London Bridge. So we have a kind of London topography there, which to me makes it an interesting possibility that what we've actually got is not so much a grand, a mutilated relic of an outdoor playhouse play, so much as something which is its first and possibly only existence is as either something to tour or something to be played in the wintertime, and therefore it's conceived of as not full length. I mean, the alternative to that is to say it's been utterly butchered.
It's interesting from as a playwright sense of it. There are a lot of characters in it who feel like they should have a slightly greater life, not necessarily a massively greater life, but there's more potential for them, especially on the sort of the royal side of things. Characters who we know die in real life, and also characters that are sort of, and I haven't got far enough on this side, the sort of the weirdness of who Morton and Newton are, in the sense that they are sort of the same person. Or they share historical things, and it's like they've been split into two people, or for some reason. And so, in that sense, it feels like the logic of the writing is for something slightly more expansive, not necessarily much more expansive.
Yes.
Because the thing is, almost all of the lords could be interchangeable, and obviously for our audio version, we've made some of them interchangeable. And, if you wanted to cut it down for touring, that sort of works. But then why give them those additional names if they then are there for one scene? And
Yeah.
it's that sort of if I was writing a smaller cast thing, I would structure it that way in terms of parts. Because the Rebel side is very logical. The Rebel side works perfectly well.
Yeah.
Dramaturgically. But the Lord side sort of feels like there's something happening there that we don't fully get.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's partly perhaps to do with the relationship between kind of pre-existing narratives of the Rising and the script we've got, because one of the things that we do know about the Peasants' Revolt is there's a variety of, not just the chronicles, but there's a variety of texts referring back to it, and they name those key rebels, Straw, Tyler, Ball, Carter, and Miller, are named in pamphlets going back to the 1530s, and so there's a sense there, a bit like Robin Hood. You've got your crew.
Yeah.
The chronicles have a much more richer and more detailed take on the various non-commons characters. So you don't have an existing sense of who's important, who's around at a particular time. What you have is a sort of sequential narrative where people pop in and pop out. So, and what we do know is that weirdly there was a fair amount of care taken with the historical sources. You know, there isn't just one historical source behind this. And that's before you even get into the idea of a sort of local oral traditions. You know, there's at least two chronicles, I think, behind this. And yet the play itself it feels like it hasn't kind of worked that through and worked that out into a coherent narrative, so that, you know, we need this character, we need that character, because historically they're there, and it's trying to do history of a kind. One of the reasons for that might be to do with where the text comes from, because, you know, for example, the textual features such as exits and entrances and speech headings are kind of problematic, but also, you know, one of the features of some manuscript versions of plays is that we have the lines first and then the speech headings later. Yeah. And so what we might have, if you like, is a sort of a dramatist's draft of a scene, and then who's speaking gets overlaid in that, perhaps later in the process, perhaps after the chronicles have been gone through again. And that might explain, it's one of the ways you can explain some of the characters who seem to say the wrong thing or are mentioned as entering but don't seem to have a line, or pop up and say one thing and then disappear. You know, it feels like it's those scenes, unlike the common scenes, are a first draft of history without really knowing where all these characters fit together. Their orientation to the king is clear. The king is the kind of, you know, the linchpin, the central figure. And it's kind of king and versus commons, but just who the and are.
Well, I mean, and this is where I've sort of been interpolating things, and, you know, you are, of course, entirely allowed to disagree with any of the decisions made in the process of, you know, in the sense the podcast version is one draft, and as we're now working towards a live version coming up next year, there is another direction we might go in. But especially considering that you've got an archbishop and a treasurer who we know die halfway through the play, of which is just asking for a scene and sort of going, there's room there in that third act for additional scenes that are not there. Yeah. Especially, it's interesting, in the editing, we've been trying to figure out the tone of that shifting of motion. Yes. Of at the end of effectively the first scene when the Hobcarter and his lot go, you know, what is the mood there across different parts of the stage? Because a lot of the rebels are probably very happy and are going off and getting drunk, or they're going off murderously, having been given license, as historically happened, to go off and go to the tower and take out various key figures. Obviously, the rebels themselves, the leaders, aren't quite happy with what's happened, and how do these sort of things all overlap? And then we've got the comedy business, which is glorious.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things that makes you think that there's a serious attempt to get it to the stage. I think, you know, I mean, the cliche about the clown is, you know, that they often sort of put their stuff together on their own, and we've certainly got elements of the kind of monologue that you find in other plays where somebody just comes on and does their bit. And one of the things I wondered when I was doing the edition was, you know, the extent to which these are kind of filler scenes, and that they're dealing with structural problems in an attempt to get the play going. But I mean, the clown gives you other things as well. I mean, particularly this kind of running common, which does seem to be integral to the whole.
Well, just before we go on, because we've got the obvious clown figure, who's actually, I think, listed as clown, is Tom Miller. But I'm also wondering, should we put Nobbs in that category as well as a darker clown? Because they almost work like a double act.
Yeah.
They're both commenting on the action, one in a light way and a fearful way frequently. There's a debate almost within himself, does he stay or does he go? At one point. Whereas Nobbs, he knows exactly where he's at from the very top. And the question is, are they both... Because it's the possibility that they could both be young, they could both be boys, is that question that came up in my mind.
Yes, I mean, that was one of the things I wondered about with the edition, because, of course, Richard historically is 14 years old.
Yeah.
And so, his kind of riding out at Smithfield is, it's not some kind of, Brian Blessed figure doing this.
No.
And so I certainly think there's an interesting structural parallel if you just say Nobbs and the King are boys.
Well, they are also doubleable, just about.
Right, okay.
It depends on your definition of whether he's on in certain scenes. You could, and again, Tom Miller to some degree, because he's always left behind.
Yeah.
Is definitely doubleable.
It does feel a little bit like, it feels more like a sort of 1570s, 1580s play in some ways than a 1590s. Not just because of the the way the casting is adaptable, as you say, but also what it's doing with iambic line and what it's doing with verse more generally. It's a million miles from Marlowe. Now, for all we know, half the London stage in the 90s was like that.
Yeah,
and we just don't have them. But it does seem to me that there's an interesting kind of crossover here between the late moralities, the moral plays, which are small cast things, and are actually published with casting lists,
yes,
aren't they?
Which are not always accurate. Can easily be doubled to 4, going, not in that scene, it isn't. That's advertising for you. Yes.
Straight out of the box, Squire. Yeah, no problem.
That's publishers for you.
Well, yeah. So I'm not sure. I mean, and then we go into the endless debate about how come certain things get published at certain times, because Straw it's one of a whole slew of playbooks that make it into there are these kind of splurges of them, and one of them happens 93-4 when Straw comes into print, and of course it's republished as well. Weirdly, for all the kind of dismissal of the play, somebody thought it was worthwhile putting it out there again. 20 years after.
well, the thing is, for all we keep using terms like, is it mutilated? It's very short. It's a really effective play. I mean, I think it works incredibly well. I used in the spoilers episodes, I think the first one, I talked about it, thinking of it like a film script.
Yeah.
Because it moves so fast, and yet it still has detail and options for characters, even if it is quite broad brush. But all the counsellors, the jostling for position behind a young king who is finding his way, who is not quite decisive, except when he is. But even then you get the impression that there's someone standing behind him. And you get that impression that the people standing behind him in the first half of the play are older, and then you have the more hot-headed characters who are standing behind him at the end. And that sort of can lead into later plays and the nature of the character of Richard as he progresses, which could be projection, but hey, it's fun to say.
That's one of the I think the under-remarked things about the play is that your typical medieval English history play thinks it's a terrible idea if you've got somebody who isn't strong on the throne. A weak king is the worst thing that can happen. And yet Richard II is effectively a child.
Yeah.
And yet he pulls through, he comes through. So I think that, my sympathies are kind of are with the rebels, but I think that whoever put this together had actually hit upon, a structural opposition.
Well,
which is that he's not just some kind of Henry V kind of transformer figure just stomping in to put everything in place.
No, there's a progression for good and ill in terms of his character that is there, and it gives an actor lots of directions they can play that, because those scenes could be played in a multitude of ways.
Sure.
For an actor and a director, and going, well, that's the thing that keeps the apple cart going. That's what keeps actors interested and audiences interested. And even the rebels, even though it's a much shallower progression, because the rebels seem to know they're probably doomed from the start. They're talking about the gallows from almost the word go. And yet they start off in quite a noble aspect. Their intentions at the very top are really good. And then very quickly it dissolves into something much less palatable.
In a sense, there are huge swathes of history which are the history of defeat. And the question is, certainly for most writers considering Commons Rising, the main thing about them was they were defeated. And yet there's this kind of Hydra-like nature, because one of the other features of writing about Commons Risings is that they're all linked together. So you've got, the next one after the Peasants' Revolt is Jack Cade. And there's a whole range of them, including, the ill-made bit of Thomas More. So it's bizarrely, that it's failed, but yet it's seeded something. Well, how do you actually try and represent that on the stage? How do you go with a kind of dramaturgy which allows you to recognize that this is great, this is wonderful, when Adam delved and he span, this. Yeah. But at the same time recognizes that the experience of the Commons and of kind of politics focusing on the Commons is hugely the experience of not only defeat, but absolutely brutal repression. What happens in 1549, what happens in 1536. It's absolutely bog standard for, monarchs to promise pardons and then to just renege on that. And so, it isn't just simply we didn't win, but reprisals were taken. Well, how do you think through your own history? If your history is one of defeat, and that's why to me it's interesting. I think in one of the spoilers, I think you sort of mused a little bit about Tyler and Straw and the kind of use of having the two figures. But one of them is that one of them is still around to speak defiance.
Yes.
And that seems to me to be speaking to an attempt to think through, really, what is good and bad. So, one of the things we know, the Chronicle, if they wanted to really just go, these are terrible people, then you would have had, scenes of despoliation, as there are in some of the Cade scenes in. Yeah.
Well, the big difference is that the rebels in Cade are there for the looting from the off. They're never at any point presented as people with a motivation that has any sort of doctrine behind it. Whereas you have in this opening scene, you have a fairly accurate rendition of John Ball's speech, though technically it's later in real life. And then you have a disparate number of voices who all have a slightly different take on things. And so you get a sense of a group which isn't wholly united. And that, to some degree, that's why they fail, because they listen to the king and Ob Carter goes off and they're going, well, we haven't... There is that thing of going, we know we haven't got what we wanted. We shouldn't really disband now. And Nobbs makes that explicitly clear in an aside that's not an aside that they hear. And I wonder how that's played, because I don't know if he's playing it as an aside and actually it's like they break that wall, or he just says it casually and that's a actor-director choice.
Yeah, I mean, the whole element of, narrating the story, of storytelling while you're in the story, I think, it's one that, some people think was invented by sort of 20th century political theatre. No. Being within a kind of plot, but also being within a story. And if people are interested in both, then what do you do? So yes, I agree. I mean, perhaps we need a kind of sense of an aside as being something as rich and varied in its possibilities as a soliloquy. We're quite happy with the idea that that sometimes it's completely kind of within the stage plot, and sometimes it's free from that, and it's an audience engagement. And the interesting thing, I suppose, is if part of that audience engagement is to do with radical politics, if you want to be sympathetic, or to do with looting or whatever, if you aren't so sympathetic. It's something that we can get a lot more out of than we have, I think.
Well, it's that thing. Once they've done a little bit of looting, between the first and third scenes, it's like they go, hang on, these people have got all this great stuff. And it's like it's the first time they've actually worn really nice clothing that they've just pinched from Rochester. And it's just that sense of almost them being corrupted by the thing they're trying to overthrow. It's, again, from very little text, I am extrapolating slightly.
But there's also that kind of sense of mockery through pastiche, isn't there? That as an appropriation of, as the proverb says, a gentleman is a social role and is endlessly kind of performable in all the kind of different senses of it. But we have ways in which we can imagine that, I think. And similarly, the notion of spoil. I mean, one of the things that is interesting about the inns as an imagined location is that the inns are full of food. Explicitly, they're kind of set up to make money out of, they're far more like kind of modern pubs rather than traditional pubs. It's all about making money off food, I think. So, a goose.
The goose scene. We've
It's kind of like
we're obliged to talk about the goose.
Like our goose, why not try? But spoil could be all sorts of things. It doesn't have to be. What's the other thing? A bundle of papers.
That scene with the burning of and the sort of exposition-y, intercomic businessy bit is quite a different. It's not like the impression when I'm editing that is that actually it's not like there's this roaring looting going on in the background. It's much more gentle, like they're becalmed. It feels weirdly relaxed, or it did when I tried to stitch scenes together. That actually the rebels have gone off drinking and they're just carousing. Yes, we have obviously in the previous act much more violent aggression with the Flemish workers. But in Act 3, weirdly, it feels much more contained and much more low-key, like the rebellion's being allowed to peter out, and it's just Tom Miller just burning some stuff.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm still divided about the Fleming, because if we say that Nobbs is a boy, one of the things that people from the Low Countries were known for was sort of being really big, really fat. So we've got a little boy or, a diminutive character kind of chasing another one around the stage, It is set up like a gag,
Yes, it's a dark comic moment. Well, it's the question of he's the only named character and it's presented as a single. But again, in terms of staging, that again also feels like it's part of a series of short. Well, because that whole act is a series of very short incidents, of which again you can almost interpolate more alarums and excursions, because that act feels much more aggressive.
And what we've got is a sort of, back to your cinematic point. I think we've got it's not quite a montage, is it? But
yeah, it's in that area, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, we've got a bare stage. I mean, there's almost no props. We don't have anybody, saying things from battlements or anything like that. It's really, really flexible and really pacey. And this is where if you come back down to the idea that whatever issues there are with the text, and there are definitely issues, it makes sense as a short piece. With a distinct aesthetic.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, though, I feel that there are gaps. There are moments when you feel like speeches just jump a cut somewhere.
Yeah, sure.
And there are questions of repositioning of material. So I wonder whether there's an element of, for printing, certain things have had to be moved around. As well as the dramaturgical questions, that there's a printing element to it.
One of the things I looked at in the edition, I didn't do as thorough a job as you've done.
I'm making it up as I'm going along.
But I did sort of speculate about some of the speeches, saying the same thing twice, and that this is possibly down to the kind of strange nature of a not entirely fully reworked manuscript. That there are some kind of, I'll meet them on the Thames. Bye bye, my lord. Why don't you meet them on the Thames? It's kind of that sort of thing going on. Can I just before we go on, can I just sort of give credit to the other person whose name I forgot? The other article that I found really inspiring was by somebody called Sally Templeman from the University of Exeter, and it's called "What's This Mutton? Food, Bodies, and In-Yard Performance Spaces in Early Shakespearean Drama." And that made me think about the goose, because it's a really interesting article, and it goes into imagining and happening in an inn yard where there's smells of food and there's pies and there's mutton. Both of those plays in different ways can be seen as interested in food, but once you place that into basically a food serving space, it becomes thinking about the goose not just as I say in the edition, emu.
Yes. I think that's almost the immediate thing of going, okay, what's the prop? What can we do with this prop?
Yeah, I think we kind of both arrived at the same conclusion, didn't we? I think if you're going to clown it, and if it's going to be used in that way, and it's not just advertising for the goose special, then it's so much funnier if you imagine it like that.
It's got to be a made prop on some level, because it's got to have a detachable head. If you're going to go to that level of trouble, then why not go the step further? I mean, that's one. There are certain logistical issues with the emu head, which I've been thinking about recently as I'm actually trying to design something we can use, and there are questions about how easily done that is, and whether the head is a more puppet on stick affair, so that the whole thing can be carried as a physical object rather than something that's more physically attached as almost part of your costume. But that's almost where doing it live as opposed to as an audio thing gives us that option to play around with.
I suppose, again, it depends how much you want to stick with that fourth wall thing. I mean, you can imagine somebody's just basically got a sort of elbow-length glove, and they're talking to what they think is the goose, and then they realise it's just the glove on there. Just kind of a double take there.
Well, it's also the fact you can do the goose's death throws as well. I mean, it depends on how long Nobbs is there behind it, because if he's got a big machete or something, you could be literally soaring away. I mean, you've only got so much dialogue to be playing with, but
the goose is trying to warn as well, sort of plucking at the kind of mantle or something like that.
And he can be going, stop it. No, I've got dialogue to say. Stop. It's the same gag is effectively reused with the Queen Mother, of you've got these two people walking upstage, looking at him doing his hanging business, and how long that plays on for, because gag opportunity there is really about the group playing together.
Here he tries it with a staff is the stage direction,
Yeah.
which means throw it up in the air to see which way it falls.
Yeah.
So it's which way the staff falls. So it's like loves me, she loves me not. It's sort of like this. But riddle me a riddle, then that sounds like the audience are involved in that. Riddle me a riddle, what's this? I shall be hanged, I shall not be hanged. Here he tries it with the staff. What does that fellow?
Yes. I've completely misinterpreted that line then. That's really useful to know. Because I read it as it was a crooked staff, and he was literally trying to hang himself up. And of course he can't because he's holding it. So that's how I read it.
Right.
So that they're watching him sort of, can I hang myself? Can I hang myself? And obviously because he's holding the thing, you know, he physically can't. That's how I read it. But
well, yes. I mean, we'd need to go into. I guess the first thing I would do is head over to the OED and to see whether "try it" can strongly refer to hanging it. So I read "tries it" as plays it, I suppose, or tests it. No, I hadn't actually thought of that. No, you could well.
Because it was the nature of the action of talking about, being hanged and.
It doesn't really matter because what you've got is somebody playing.
Yes.
That's the point. It's going to look stupid with your suggestion or my suggestion. Even more stupid with your suggestion.
I mean, that's the question. It's basically he needs to look strange for the joke to work.
You've also got, that's a nice link to what you did in the pod, in the spoilers anyway, with Swingled and Thrangled, that moment in the performance there where you could sort of hear it, being sort of physicalized almost. You've got the sort of little noises there that the actor put in. So that's a nice little that's a nice little seeding that you've got there already.
Well, so one of the things we're putting in for the audio is we're putting in an epilogue. So we're reusing Nobbs' speech about Swingled and Thrangled.
Right.
So what we've got at the end is that because Nobbs disappears, basically, says I'm off, and is never heard of again. We don't know what happens to him. I've put him down as a turncoat, and he's actually leads the execution party for Ball and Watt. And he actually I repurposed that speech as slightly changing the tense. As they are hanged, as he's the only survivor of the rebels. I'm killing off Tom Miller as well. He dies in the melee.
Right.
I'm being quite brutal for the final cut. It's just as part of the melee at the end of Act 3. There is a little bit of Tom Miller going "ah." So that's as close as we get.
Well, I get that with the kind of darkness that you're talking about, with the kind of storytelling element, and you're all going to die, and we're all that completely works. I think. I mean, I suppose I would want to hold out when imagining an early modern performance.
Oh yes.
That there might be other options, I think, but I can completely see that, especially if you've got to make something work on the stage. But if you're trying to get through to kind of contemporary audiences, then that's one of the tropes we're used to. Yeah, I completely get that.
It's the other thing that, weirdly, elements of this work really well as audio because they're quite active and action-based. Certain bits don't. I mean, the bit with the goose is a bit doomed. We've sort of changed the last line of that speech and given it to Nobbs stealing the goose and running off with the final line, just so it sort of comes vaguely across, but it's sort of a case of we can only win certain battles and we lose others in terms of that. Any elements of what you've heard in the spoilers that you absolutely resolutely disagree with our interpretation? I like to be wrong.
I was just really interested to see what you were doing. Because remembering that the edition was sort of 20 years ago, but I was thinking about how the text was put together, and I think your stage directions, I think they come from a later version.
Possibly. So
yeah, so some of those are editorial,
right.
But that doesn't really matter. Except, I suppose, it sort of pushes you in a direction that you might not have gone in.
Yeah.
But it's not an objection as such, you know. But I was just enjoying it, you know. I wasn't. I mean, if you want me to, I'll go back and listen to it in a more critical manner and send you a list of notes.
Well, that's it's. I try to talk about things as a producer rather than necessarily a historian or that side of things, because it's it's not technically my job, and so I am wary of saying things too definitely or making any errors, which are changeable. I can go back and re-edit, and if there is something that is in plain error, then I can remove it and replace it, so long as it's not really finicky.
And also, when in a sense, I have the luxury of not having to get it on its feet. So I can sort of leave things nicely suspended as a thought experiment. I mean, you actually do need to decide how many people you've got in a scene, and what their orientation is to the monarch, and whether you can usefully distinguish in terms of characterization between one kind of language and another kind of language, or is it just kind of, I thought one of the interesting things, you were able to do that with some of those longer speeches, is you were able to kind of give them a sort of character inhabiting them, but you actually have to do that for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, there's still a lot of work to do on that. I really think that those longer speeches will pull out more. I definitely think that's going to be the advantage of doing something over a longer period of time, because obviously my actors, they come in for a few hours. They've had the script. In future we're now moving to a place where people have more material now going forward. I've moved a couple of bits. So Richard's speech on the water, or as he gets off the water, has now been moved retrospectively. So when Newton is having his conversation with Spencer, it's and the king said, he says at some point, or something, and I've cut it as a flashback of the king saying, "Let's get the hell out of here," just for the logic of audio. There's a lot going on, and I wanted something that pieced together. So there's a few little interventions in the final cut to make it flow as audio, and that's an interesting question for the stage. I would expand, and we've got the options of music, we've got the options of hopefully supernumeraries. I'm hoping we'll have a decent additional crowd presence, because that was the other character I wanted to talk about, is everybody who's not a person. The crowd scenes, almost all of this seems to be done before an audience at some point, and so who's speaking honestly and who's speaking to a crowd with an agenda changes what these scenes do.
Absolutely, yeah, and then that leads you into kind of various imaginings of the audience's crowd, and the kind of sense of that was then and this is now. And if you go back to sort of early modern sense, then you get it gets ever more complicated, because you then start to imagine what people might have thought about or responded to the subject matter, and you sort of spiral away, really. But absolutely, I mean, it's absolutely crucial, because this isn't a random collection of names having an argument about something. This is a key moment. Whether in the early modern period, whether you were in it or not, and you have to do a lot of burrowing and a certain amount of reconstruction to find a different attitude to the one expressed in the chronicles. But it comes down to the kind of the question of, this actually matters. It matters because it's our past as Londoners, but it matters because, a couple of years after this is performed, there's martial law, in London, and people are being kind of made an example of on the scaffold for, it's a kind of a vital thing, I think. And, more broadly, it's the founding moment, whether you like the idea of a radical tradition or whether you think it's a terrible idea, but everybody sees that as the start. The starting point. It's a key moment in English history, and it's one that keeps on popping up, and the way in which the commons are represented, and the way in which they're concerns are articulated, just recur and recur. And that's why it's so important that we have a preacher who's voicing something which everybody knows has an afterlife. And particularly, that proverb is still a live proverb. It goes on being a live proverb.
Oh, yes.
Right through to the French Revolution, it's still doing its business. And there's all sorts of kind of links there.
We have the Adam Deld Eve Span, it turns up in Gentleness and Nobility, which we've already done on the podcast. And, it's like all these allusions do keep turning up as common phrases. I think the multitude are called a beast of many...
multitude of beasts of many heads.
Yes, and that pops up all over the place. It's very difficult to know what the rebels are talking like. I mean, we know it's not the straight verse that we get for the Lords.
Yeah.
That dialogue is much trickier to work with.
The dramaturgy of the Lords, the characterization at the structural side is really difficult, but the tone is dead easy. To find, and it's the sort of opposite with the Commons. That dramatically, it's they actually get to do the active stuff. Most of the kind of non-Commons characters, they're either being executed or they're reacting, which is why I still think that there is a structural problem within the play that they haven't quite solved. I still think it works as a short play.
Oh yes, no, I the only real problem I have is that I really need it structurally to be longer, and I need to solve that problem.
Yeah.
Either just run it as a one-actor and then create another one-actor afterwards. I mean, it will be longer on stage than it is as the audio, because audio is always quicker.
You won't get much help from the Chronicles, I think. I mean, I think this is one of the things. It doesn't really give you a lot of help.
No.
And okay, we can extemporize a clown scene. That's cool, because that's what the Commons do. So that works completely, and it's ye olde merry Englandy as well, so that's great. But it's really difficult to do that with the non-Commons characters. The difficulty with the Commons characters is not structurally how we do their scenes. The difficulty is the tone, as you say. So you've got this weird sort of two-part problem where the tone of the non-Commons characters is fine, because we know how people would respond to this stuff. That's in the Chronicles. That's dramatically nicely established, but the tone of the Commons characters is completely the opposite. Where's our template? How do we do this? We know what the Chronicles say, but that's not going to fly as drama.
I'm almost thinking of a framing device where we just also to give the audience a bit more context of the social position that everybody's in, and sort of try and slightly move away from the peasants side of the peasants' revolt. So it's a much more complicated revolt than that. Thinking of it as just yokel kind of peasant coins doing revolt is not what this is about. These are articulate people from all sorts of classes, many of them not actually that necessarily unwealthy, because when you're complaining about being taxed, you need to have some money to be taxed.
Disgusted of Kent.
Yes.
The taxpayers' alliance.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, but it starts really strongly as well. Because the whole. That's literally in the Chronicles. Is okay, you pay a tax for the adults. Well, how do we know if they're adults? We lift up their shift.
Yeah.
And, the Chronicles actually use the word, sort of slightly indelicate word, undergrown. So it's basically once you hit puberty, and well, how do you tell if somebody's hit puberty? You actually, it's a sort of strip search.
Yeah. And that's definitely something that I think could be done, to give that sense of outrage, more clarity for a modern audience. It's there. And the emotion is there for the actors, but I think just a little bit more context.
It's one of the things that when sort of notoriously Robert Southey, who was by then poet laureate, so after Waterloo, become a sort of establishment figure, and to embarrass him, people dug up this Wat Tyler play.
Yeah.
And he does it with a whole load of Robin Hood and Maypole and Merry Englandy stuff, which is rudely kind of shattered by this awful bureaucrat. basically. So he takes his time over the sort of establishing shots of, the village green, as it were, But I mean, by then we're into a totally different kind of discourse, really.
Yeah.
But here it's medias res, straight away, get on with it, And actually, we don't need anything else to be the motivating. The order which is shattered. We don't need to, sort of see bucolic
I wouldn't.
happy rural families. It's enough that this guy is lifting up the shift of this teenage girl.
Yeah.
And their dad is coming in there going, what?
Yeah.
This stands for everything that, that's our kind of, are you for it or against it? No, we're against it. Right then. Okay,
right.
What we do now
let's articulate we've got this speaker here who's going to articulate our manifesto, and then let's get off.
And also, this is the founding moment because, when various other kind of commons groups march on London, they take the same route. This is the kind of the moment where it all kicks off. Ball is both articulating a traditional proverbial biblically inflected wisdom and providing us with the founding moment of it. So he's doing two things at once there. So when they're talking about wealth and liberty, they're not, people think, oh, the wealth, that's the spoil, but liberty is actually to do with, the legal status of bondmen. It's gesturing at a sense of that, there is a real bid for freedom in a way that it's a sort of William Wallace moment.
Yeah.
But it's to do with the status of bondmen under the law and what can be done to them and how they can be treated. And Richard goes, yeah. And then you just stand everybody down and, we promise. Yeah, how very different from the politics of the present day it all seems.
Yes. It's interesting also that final act, how you play the aftermath and how much political theatre is going on. The debate of who do we kill? I really want to kill these people, well, if we do it this way, it will make you look really good. Just pardon everyone except the people we really hate. And I really like the way that Morton is set up to really hate the rebels as well by how he's treated at the beginning. That weird thing that historically, I think his name, there's a Sir John Newton who had Rochester and who had his stuff nicked and was there sent as messenger. But all of that detail seems to have been added to Morton, and that is interesting. And I haven't as of yet found Morton. I don't know if you know who historically that person might have been. But it's nice as a character that he's got this motivation to really wants Wat Tyler and Ball to die horribly, and they have this slanging match.
Yes,
as they push his buttons.
and one of the features of the original printed playtext is that the King's pardon is printed in black letter. Yeah, which is the proclamation typeface. Yeah. It's in the actual kind of early printing. It's like a facsimile of an official document. I mean, one of the things that leads us to, back to where the text comes from is whether there's no point in somebody memorizing that stuff.
Oh no.
It's a prop.
That's a prop.
Yeah. What we've probably got there then is. Well, what we've possibly got, I should say, is that we've got a prop as one of the things that it feeds into the printed text. That what we've got there is something that's likely to be pretty close to performance, if we've got a performance. Yeah. Whereas other things about the text, you worry about the kind of relationship between what we've got and performance. But if we think it's performed, then we've got that all written down as a performance prop. But what we get is there's a strange convention to do with sort of scaffold speeches, which is one convention is, I humbly beg pardon of everybody, I meekly accept my fate. And the other is to transgress that and play around with it. So Thomas Moore in that in that manuscript play, he's on the scaffold and he says, yes, I wish to confess that His Majesty has always been very nice to me. And he kind of nearly sidesteps which is typical of more the character, because he's kind of Olympic standard quibbler. You mess with him in Latin at your peril. Tyler and Ball have got a version of that. Yeah, well, we're all going to die anyway. If I had my time over again, if I had to do it all over again, I'd do it all over you. And Ball said, if I had my time again, I would go fractal on your ass, because every word should be a whole sermon. And Morton says, okay, suffer them not to speak. Well, I've said too much. I've said enough, actually. His words are poison in the ears of the people. Yeah, well, are they? Because then we flip back into, we loop. He doesn't get the chance to do his Blackheath sermon again, but it's a callback. And yeah, okay, we know what Morton thinks about it, but what does the audience think? And then Tyler says, "You're so lusty with a pox. I pulled you out of Rochester Castle."
Yeah.
By the pole.
Yes.
Well, I'll put your head on a pole.
Yes.
Oh God.
He's really they goaded him to be dragged down to that kind of back and forth, and it's really quite well done. And you're right when you're talking about the crowd, because we've got the official pardons, so they're all safe.
Yeah.
Then do they manage to get a rise from the crowd from what they say? That's a really interesting question, actually, about what will happen if I get lots of bodies, and where they go and what they do.
I mean, I've been thinking of it as a kind of northern in-house play, but if you imagine any of these historical plays taking place on the South Bank, and you imagine people crossing London Bridge as opposed to taking the taxi over the Thames, then they're going to be walking past these things, and historically, on tour again, rebels' skulls are fixed at, and Micklegate Bar in York and various other kind of prominent locations.
Is there any conversation between this play and, say, some of the other sort of orbiting history plays, the Edward III or the Thomas of Woodstock, or...
I mean, the three plays about Richard II, they kind of seem to be very different beasts, but it depends how much you think people knew about Richard II. So did people know that there's a Jack Straw Part 2, which is Woodstock, where Richard has completely gone off the rails, and he's surrounded himself with, not with kind of wise archbishops, but these kind of, these sort of trust fund teenagers, and he's just trashing the place, and he's the one who's darkening his face and turning up at people's houses with sort of disorderly music. In Woodstock, Richard is actually doing what the Commons do in Jack Straw, which is sort of parodying good order and killing one of his uncles, or arranging to have one of his uncles killed. We also have Simon Foreman talking about seeing a Richard II play at the Globe the day before Il May Day, where, I can't remember if he says if it's Straw or Tyler gets killed. And but interestingly, Foreman doesn't go, and so end all rebels. He says, this just shows, you want to watch out for these royal characters, because they're going to stab you if they get the chance. So we've got a range of texts, and then we've got references to historical knowledge in these texts, and then we have, how many more Richard II plays are there out there, and what happens in those, and how do they speak to the ones we've got? Because you remember that Woodstock, again, we've got a manuscript. We don't have a printed play, but Straw, to me, still feels like it feels like if there was a proper worked through staged version of it, what we've got in print doesn't reflect that working through. We've either got a manuscript which may, something which just needed another edit and needed a revision and didn't make it to the stage, or we've got a staged version of it, but what we've got in print doesn't reflect that. And that's actually true of, is it An Actor No a Knave? The play which advertises itself as having Kemp's applauded merriments. And actually, you excitedly turn to Kemp's applauded merriments and they're not there.
No.
We've got this sort of strange sort of the script we've got kind of both feels very highly worked in terms of, somebody's clearly gone back to the chronicles, and not just one chronicle, tried to kind of get it historically right, but dramatically that historical stuff isn't fully integrated in what we've got. But but who knows? We don't know what company it's for. We don't know if it's 15 years old. We don't know if there are possibly elements of censorship, although I'm less ready to explain everything away by saying, oh, well, that's obviously a censor. Well, I think it's more complicated than that, I think.
Yes, and it's also, it's questions of individual taste, or what manuscript working from, or the printer just saying, I don't like that bit, or I want it to be this size edition, or what they think is marketable. I think there's a lot more whimsy and random chance caprice going on.
If we have some kind of celestial computer with all the versions of Jack Straw there ever were, where are we? Are we at 1.1? Are we at 1.2? Are we at 2.0? What file name would God give this?
Yeah.
And what are we trying to do now, as scholars or as theatre makers with that, what are we reaching for? And some of that is a negotiation with the here and now, and some of it is a negotiation with what the script suggests but maybe doesn't give us in terms of an early modern performance or an early modern shaping of understanding of historical commons action.
Ultimately, I can just put all that to one side and say this is the script, and this is material from which I will craft a stage show. If it works, it stays, and if it doesn't work, then there'll be adjustments, and that's going to happen because I want to present the best show. And maybe that's just the fate of Jack Straw as a text.
But it's still tremendously valuable practice as research.
Yeah.
Because there's that weird moment, because it goes to Tyler and his wife, and you think, oh, this is what Tyler, and then it isn't, it's Jack Straw. So it does occur to me that there's possibly another kind of revamp on the hoof going on there.
It's that thing that they are almost interchangeable in that sense. And
it looks like they've decided to go with Tyler, and then they go with Straw.
Yeah.
But because they mentioned the wife, I'm thinking, oh, well, maybe they thought, hey, was he in the Peasants' Revolt? Let's make this into something. And they go, oh no, we can't actually. Let's have Jack Straw instead. It's a little bit more fluid in some of the historical stuff we've got. I think but
it's like there's an artistic decision. Which one do we go for? Let's go for Jack.
It also kind of works if you don't know what Tyler is. Jack Straw is a pseudonym. It just means sort of nobody. It's like Robin Hood, A Jack Straw is a worthless thing. So, it's a little bit like, Guy Fawkes' mask sort of thing. It's a popular. So there is a kind of strange, almost folk drama element to the original Rising, which they sort of managed to keep in there by calling. So you'll know what a Jack Straw is, even if you know nothing about 1381.
Yeah.
And that immediately, to me, you see, that would send a signal that it's about Jack Straw rather than what Tyler. It has that kind of Robin Hood overlay, because it's obvious, it's fairly obvious that there wasn't a real person called Jack Straw. Even if you know it, you think, well, it's a pseudonym, What's it? I think it's 1549. I think one of them's called Captain Cobbler or something like that. Typically these risings, people do kind of adopt their superhero names.
Well, it's the fact that the rebellion had so many leaders, and it wasn't one lead from the front. The play does still hint at that, because in the sense that you're both leaders, anointed by John Ball as joint leaders, so there isn't a single figurehead even within the play. Jack Straw isn't really the leader of the revolt. He's the spark for the revolt.
And that's interesting again, because in other plays with kind of Commons Risings, there is this kind of tendency to slip into the leader and dupes sort of model.
There's a little hint of that in here. I mean, I don't think it is, but there's in that first scene, there's just that little bit of manoeuvring of who's in charge and or who's really in charge.
Yeah, there's a sort of hubbub, isn't there, which is, be ruled by me. Be ruled by me, and I've read some really tone-deaf criticism which goes, they all want to be rulers. And they go, no, they're just saying, it's my turn now, listen to me,
And that's the thing, is that the rebellion does change and their attitudes change as it goes on. But that first scene is very open, very democratic. There's a sort of figuring things out. And it's only later on that everything gets a bit harder and bad things have happened along the way. Yeah. And they're a bit morally compromised by the time you get to Act 3. Because you've got people behind them who are pushing for that. So you've got people like Nobbs, who's obviously out there to just steal whatever he can and just have a laugh. The Tom Miller, who doesn't really do anything, he's just along with the gang. It's almost peer pressure, isn't it? And here's a question for you. Is Tom Miller supposed to actually be funny? Because it's like he's almost like his jokes are trying too hard.
I don't know, because I mean, if you look at these sort of longish routines, they don't come over as very funny either. But I mean, I think it's really difficult, isn't it? Because there's obviously a sense in which our practice today has a continuity with the practice of 400 years ago, because you can do what you're doing and you can bring new things out of it. But equally, there's a sense in which these people are kind of unfathomable. And you get this a bit with Tarleton, don't you, as well? These kind of amazing jests that everyone thinks are so brilliant. You
had to be there. You had to be there.
Well, it's kind of, and some of that is, some of that, and it's an older kind. But if you go into the jest books as well, some of these stories are just, they are really painful. They rely on a kind of a really crude sense of humour. So I'm not sure, really. I mean, I think it depends on what kind of communion with the audience you want him to have.
It's like he makes some terrible jokes, and they are supposed to be a bit funny, but are they? The funny business seems to be the more physical where he plays. And I mean, again, it's going to really depend on who gets cast. I mean, he's supposed to be very short, the text seems to suggest, which is another reason why I was sort of wondering, is he another boy?
Yeah.
Because then you can sort of hit the magic number of four boy performers with the Queen Mother, who I'd love to... I keep trying to make a better part than she is, but there are problems with the Queen Mother. My woman's mazed mind is not a classic.
Yes, yeah. It's like, well, we know we have to actually have her here.
Yes.
Because
she was historically a very interesting person. She was a much more interesting person from what my limited research so far than anything this play suggests.
Well, yeah. And it's difficult, isn't it? Yeah. My feeling is that there's always an element of play about the representation of Commons Risings, and that's to do partly historically. There's elements of parody and degradation and things being destroyed and things being mocked. But I think it's also to do with the flip side of that, which is it is a kind of holiday. It is a topsy-turvy in a positive sense as well. And so I think there's an argument for saying, well, historically, this is not necessarily a bunch of kind of, Terminators killing LA cops, do you know what I mean? for you to for there to be a proper challenge, there has to be a proper challenge for Richard to overcome it. But also there's a sense of continuity here with other forms of kind of festive and ritual life, which every age imagines were more fully realised in days gone by. So the kind of the Elizabethan cliche is there will never be a merry world, or there was never a merry world since. So this is the merry world. It would be great if actually life was like this, if all the year we're playing holiday, and of course it isn't. But we have to, I think it's much more interesting to actually have that as a tension, and it kind of remains a tension, I think, because I think that's the point of the way those last words go. One of the things that I think about Tyler's last words is when Morton comes back with that, so I'm going to poll you, and it's all very kind of Newman and Baddiel,
Yes.
And then he goes, "Oh, for God's sake, let's just poll me now. Poll me now. I can't stand any more of this." Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
It's kind of like, oh, shit, that's such a terrible comeback. I think I'd rather die. Yeah, I read. I mean, I obviously we're all prone to generous readings if sort of politics or other things are involved. But I read that as a slight recuperation of that sort of festive anarchy, because Morton, you're right, he is the kind of he's the hatchet-faced apparatchik who's restoring order. Well, on the one hand, yeah, that's pretty good, I guess. On the other hand, well, yeah, this was all about the tax collector. Morton is, spiritually speaking, he's going to be right. Okay, back to business, guys. And of course, what happens in Woodstock, if you remember, the near the end of that, there's that whole blank charters thing,
yes.
where basically you're having to sign the check, and then Richard will fill the amount in later.
Yeah. So you get that sense of that little hint of a journey that you could thread these plays together in a season, which is sort of my long-term thinking, is that an almost alternative history cycle.
Which takes us back to that was precisely the motivation for the PhD all those years ago. We know that companies have plays on the same monarch. We know there's an element of competition there. We know that people reboot.
Yes.
Medieval English history is the Marvel universe. It's kind of like we'll go back and have another go. And it kind of doesn't belong to anybody. So to the extent that you get, Kemp goes and plays John Oldcastle with Worcester's men at the Rose, which is like however far it is from 200 yards from the Globe.
I think you present this to an audience and they will just have considerably more fun.
But it's different to the fun that the Queen's Men give you, because Famous Victories, Famous Victories has got Tarleton wandering around, presumably Tarleton wandering around Agincourt, robbing people,
Yes.
They're much larger scale, they're obviously achieved productions, but they don't have this kind of focus and intensity, which makes me again, I'm almost inclining to the view that the Queen's Men were doing their stuff all around the country, but meanwhile other people were trying different. This is a London play in the way that the Queen's Men plays aren't, and it's the first. Well, it's the first London historical play. I mean, it's possible the contention is a contemporary thing, but that's not really a play about London. And this is a play about London.
Yeah. It's very much picks the rebellion starts outside London, but everything else happens, within it or on the outskirts, and that's the narrative they're telling. They're not telling the wider revolt.
No, they very definitely do, because the chronicles are full of St Albans and Leicester and all sorts of other places, Essex.
Well, at Suffolk and Norfolk, some of the stuff happening. You've got rampaging priests taking out the rebels. It's great.
What's going on? This is, one of the issues with this is it's experimental. I think. I mean, the more seriously you take it, the more you have to I think, rethink some of your assumptions. You know, I mean, and the shame is, I suppose, that so few people have actually taken it seriously. You know, I mean, we're into, I don't know how many, 200 Red Not Deads, you know, and nobody's got around to doing it. You know?
And it's the other thing is that one of the sort of emphases that I've had over the last couple of years is to be looking at plays which are scalable, which people without many actors could do. You know, on the principle that, you know, there's a lot of room for students or fringe where you could do these things on the cheap. You know, I think that's a good way of a good entry route for people. I'm looking at this. If I really wanted to boil it down to a really reduced company, you could do it just about with some manipulation 6. You know, it'd be a different play, but you'd get all the action, all the text, and just one or two swapping of dialogues and conflation of characters. It's a history play you could do with very few people, and there aren't many plays apart from John Bale's, you know, King John, that you could do that with. And it's also not too long, and I think the potential for this is actually huge in a way that other history plays would struggle.
It's sort of fringe versus national theatre, isn't it? I mean, the conceptions are just completely opposed.
Because you're right, there's no real major properties going on here. It's all costuming and a few discrete bits and pieces. But, you know, the scale of it can shift up and down. And
I have a feeling, Lord Mayor shows, I've got a feeling, you know, that there was a Jack Straw.
Oh yes, he's mentioned, yes.
Yeah, for the 1590 Lord's Mayor's show. Let me find it in the edition.
Yes,
Jack Straw, the rebel I present. Wat Tyler was my aide. Hob Carter and Tom Miller too. We all were not afraid. That's all of them, apart from Ball.
And that is that. I mean, is that before the play or after the play?
Well, who knows? That's the Lord Mayor show from 1590.
Yes, because that's the Nelson one, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So because Walworth is fishmongers, and so is Nelson. Yeah.
So is that thing? Is that bouncing off the play, or is the play bouncing off whatever that was bouncing off? And that's the conversation
Tom
between
Miller.
them. Yeah.
That's the thing.
Yeah, it is.
That because, you know, the Chronicles are really all about Tyler, Straw and Ball. I mean, the others get a mention.
Yeah.
But there seems to be this grouping of names. But whether they're just plugging into some kind of pre-existing thing.
It's the kind of connection I like. It feels like there is a conversation, even if we don't know which way it's going.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a conversation, and that the great thing about Jack Straw is that it really does require getting on its feet. I mean, thinking about it for audio means you think about it physically in a sort of weird backwards way. But I'm expecting to find things don't work. I mean, it's like the whole sequence with the sword and the death of Jack Straw, which I still don't quite understand how that works. And that's one of the big questions for when we do it, of how and what is going on. Because who has which sword and whose sword is it? Is it on behalf of the king, or is it literally the king's sword? Is it actually get passed? Does it not get passed? Are there inferred actions there?
He gets hit on the head, doesn't he?
Yeah, it's
I arrest you.
Yeah, it's that. It's a whole series of actions or options for actions that I don't have a final answer for yet.
Is there anything about horseback? I can't remember. I mean, I think the Chronicles say.
Oh yeah, in the real world. I believe that was he just rode on and went for him, and it was seen very much from a distance. No one was quite sure how precisely it happened, because they call it a sword, but I think it was a dagger in real terms. I don't think it was a big weapon. It was hidden. I think that's the again, I've only read a certain amount on the actual history so far, so I could be talking out of my hat. Any other thoughts? Because I think we've definitely run out of steam, haven't we?
I'm sorted out, I think. But I mean, I've had so many ideas just kind of getting myself back up to speed with the play that what I really want to do now is to get stuck into it again sort of the other way around, really. Now that, sort of maybe I'll send you some ideas or something,
No,
So
any thoughts? I mean, it is really helpful to talk to someone who thought about the play in some detail.
And there's been so much exciting work as well. I mean, it's been ridiculous how much we've found out about theatres in the last 10 years.
Oh, yes. I mean, just the physical archaeology of it all.
Yeah, absolutely.
It makes such a difference. Right. Well, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
For this.
Really enjoyed it.
Many thanks to Dr. Stephen Longstaffe for sharing his time and material on the life and death of Jack Straw. Links to all the Jack Straw materials are in the show description. You've been listening to the Beyond podcast. Follow us on Twitter at Beyond Shakes. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Beyond Shakespeare. Or buy us a coffee on ko-fi.com/Beyond Shakespeare. And all that jazz. Till next time, I've been your host, Robert Crighton. Goodbye.